When the massive bureaucracy of the medieval church suddenly grinds to a halt, it usually points to a systemic collapse, a war, a famine, something huge. But in the 14th century archives of a tiny Yorkshire village, we find an anomaly that points to something, well, far more unsettling. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, I'm putting on my medieval historian hat, and we're going to conduct a formal, forensic archival investigation into the abrupt, chilling cessation of the Ampleforth parish records.
We're going to begin with this really striking piece of local oral history. He does not sleep. He does not rest. He walks the village at nightfall, and where his shadow falls, the living do not wake. Now, while oral history is occasionally dismissed by modern scholars as just folklore, this specific account is deeply rooted in an actual physical artifact, an artifact that totally defies standard historical explanation. That artifact, which is preserved today at the Borthwick Institute, is a registry entry from 1349. We have to remember, under medieval canon law, record keeping wasn't just a job, it was a sacred, non-negotiable duty. Yet when you look at this physical parchment, the quill literally stops dead. The ink just trails off into a smear. The entry stops mid-word. We are going to methodically unpack exactly why a man trained by the Archbishop of York's meticulous registry simply abandoned his sacred post. Okay, let's dive into the timeline to establish the macro-level epidemiological context here. The Black Death entered England through the port of Melcombe Regis in June 1348. By that winter, it had pushed its way north into Yorkshire, finally hitting the isolated agricultural settlement of Ampleforth in the spring of 1349. But it wasn't until the autumn that a highly anomalous mortality pattern actually began in this specific parish. To really understand the systemic collapse of parish ministry in this era, we need to grasp the sheer scale of the devastation. We're talking about an estimated 30 to 60% of Europe's total population completely wiped out in just 4 years. The Archbishop of York's registry documents a catastrophic acceleration in clergy mortality during this time. Parishes were losing their priests way faster than replacements could be trained and ordained. So missing records, they're common. But the records from Ampleforth aren't just missing. Part 1. The Archival Anomaly of Ampleforth Parish. Against that backdrop of mass casualty, what survives in Ampleforth are fragments, a mortuary roll, and that partial registry entry. And both of these documents abruptly cease. Paleographically speaking, there's a fundamental difference between a natural ending and a violent interruption. The standard academic explanation assumes the scribe just succumbed to the plague right there at his desk, but the localized data suggests a much more complex sequence of events. Notice the stark contrast in these mortality patterns. Typical plague mortality acts like a fire. It causes cluster deaths, burning rapidly through shared air and food within a single household or street. But the Ampleforth deaths, they were sequential, linear. They occurred strictly one by one, radiating directly outward from the churchyard. Medieval observers recognized this linear sequence not as your typical contagion, but as something older, something else entirely. Our archival witness testimonies record that the first death in this chain was the previous priest, who died what seemed to be an ordinary plague death in the spring. However, 6 weeks later, the graves immediately surrounding his plot showed signs of outward disturbance. Crucially, 2 parishioners reported hearing footsteps on the path between the church and the village after midnight, and these footsteps weren't approaching or retreating, they were circling. So the new priest at Ampleforth, the very man who would eventually leave that severed record, wrote a letter describing what these witnesses had told him. He documented a tall figure standing at the tree line after dusk, moving strangely. To describe it, he utilized the specific Latin term incongruous. Incongruous. Out of place. He coldly describes a presence that simply shouldn't be, wrong, in a way that the language of the time just couldn't be more precise about. He wrote that his blessings of the churchyard boundary had failed, and then his letter stops. Part 2. Supplementary Witness Testimonies. Let's cross-reference that with a secondary account. A traveling Benedictine monk, Brother Thomas of Byland, passed through the village and recorded a pretty terrifying encounter. A gravedigger's assistant had literally fled his work preparing a new plot. He claimed the ground near the old priest's grave was recently disturbed from within, and that he heard regular, slow breathing coming from the earth, breathing that sounded unneeded, like it was just going through the motions. Brother Thomas himself stayed the night in the church, praying, and recorded hearing a single sound at 3 a.m., a heavy weight settling near the churchyard. By morning, the ground was totally undisturbed, and the heavy iron gate was latched from the outside. Now, as a trained observer, Thomas maintained a very flat, factual tone in his writing. He didn't theorize, he didn't claim it was demons. He noted only one final detail as he rode away before the village woke. He observed a human-shaped shadow moving across the exterior stone wall of the church. The shadow moved at a walking pace, yet there was absolutely no visible light source capable of casting it.
Part 3. The Administrative Erasure.
So the really crucial point here is how the bureaucracy of the church responded over the subsequent months. The administrative erasure of Ampleforth is absolute. Look at the progression here. In 1349, the registry stops mid-word, leaving a 14-month gap in the clergy. By 1350, the mortuary rolls show total silence. The village essentially vanishes from the ecclesiastical record. Then, in 1351, it reappears as a cold bureaucratic land survey, just an inventory of entirely empty properties.
Depopulated villages were certainly common in Plague-era England, but this rapid, undocumented vanishing classifies Ampleforth as a deserted medieval village, or DMV. What makes Ampleforth so remarkable to us as historical investigators is the total lack of archaeological evidence for slow attrition. There's no final list of the dead. There are no recorded mass graves. The village is simply there, and then it is not. Which prompts the obvious question: what exact mechanism caused such a sudden total depopulation?
Part 4, 14th Century Epidemiology.
To answer that, we have to step away from modern science and apply the medical frameworks actually available to a 14th century mind. Let's look at the esteemed 12th century historian William of Newburgh. He was a careful, rigorous thinker who actively dismissed most superstitions of his day. Yet in his records, he meticulously documented these exact repeating Yorkshire patterns. A man dies, is buried, and neighbors begin dying sequentially around his grave. Critically, Newburgh did not attribute this to spiritual demons. He clinically labeled the source as a cadaver, an actual physical walking corpse. He treated it as a terrifying but completely physical phenomenon.
This physical interpretation maps directly onto miasma theory. We have to understand, this wasn't just folklore. This was the leading epidemiological science of the era. It was the official medical consensus endorsed by prestigious faculties like the University of Paris. Miasma theory stated that decaying matter produced invisible, lethal clouds of corruption. This bad air physically moved from the source, spreading sickness to literally anyone who breathed it.
Observe how this epidemiological model builds a terrifyingly rational logic. Step 1. A body decays, producing deadly corrupted air. Step 2. This miasma physically moves from the grave. Step 3. Neighbors nearest the grave die in a strict sequence. Step 4. Desperate, terrified observers see this directional wave of death, and they personify the invisible, tracking miasma as the deceased walking among them. And that is exactly why this matters to our archival investigation. The cold, rational medical theory of the 14th century inadvertently provided a framework that was far more horrific than mere superstition. The logical conclusion of their actual, accepted science was the idea of a pestilence walker, something that carries death from house to house, something that used to be a neighbor, something you recognize. The rational explanation actually made the horror infinitely worse. So we now understand the epidemiology and the sociology of how these villagers processed their grim reality. Yet the physical anomaly of that manuscript remains. The priest saw something at the tree line. His blessings failed, he stopped writing in the absolute middle of a word, and his entire village vanished into silence, leaving us with a permanent, chilling void in the historical archive. What was his final word?